Again, welcome back to everyone. And I think the purpose of this session is to try to raise questions that you can work on together in the workshops. To try and move, I think as Father Kevin said, yes, talk is important, but how would it manifest in action where we are? And I think I retired from frontline politics after serving as a councillor in Leeds very young and having the privilege of representing an inner city part of West Leeds, a cake slice going out towards the Ring Road for 23 years. I had the privilege of being a government minister in that time, still lived in the same house in the same neighbourhood, but I don't think that representative jobs should be jobs for life. I never expected to be there 23 years, so I stepped down. And some of the good people of West Leeds said, well, we're glad you stepped down because you haven't done too much damage and we'll let you live in the neighbourhood. So I live in my neighbourhood now, and I tend to spend my time working in one of the poorest communities near Armley Prison in Armley, for anyone that knows it. It's a broken community, relationships crushed. People have been in and out of prison, problems with drugs and alcohol, but at the same time, some strong community is being built up in our neighbourhood among some of the poorest in the city. And when I asked them on Friday, yesterday, I said, I'm coming to this conference with religious people, what should I say? And so, what's the theme? Just talk. Well, for God's sake, get them to tell us good news stories because we're sick of the news. So I've come really to suggest that maybe we search out good news stories, but perhaps more important, ask where do the good news stories come from? Who do they come from? Bonhoeffer, the martyr in Germany under Nazi Hitler's Germany, he said the first service that Christians must give to each other is the service of listening. The service of listening. Oscar Romero, in his last homily before he died, said the task of the church is twofold. Tell the truth about reality and accompany the people. That twin task. And both are very difficult tasks. To tell the truth, but also to accompany the people. I brought along, we rush through encyclical letters from the popes in the Catholic Church. We never see them at Mass or handed out at the back of church. The bishops don't often refer to them. We're on about the 10th one. We had Benedict and then ones from Francis. And now from Pope Leo, we're on Magnificat Humanitas, dealing with AI. But before that, don't neglect this little one that was slipped in, written by both Francis and Leo together, on love for the poor, apostolic exhortation. And at the end of that book, Pope Leo said 2 things we have to do. Treat the poor as agents of their own future. Don't do for, but do with. And his second theme was the need to challenge the causes of injustice and poverty and hold those two together. I'll put the book behind me, but say, I think it's a bit of a handbook of how we do that work of working with and being closer to, and at the same time challenging causes and power, as Billy spelt out so dramatically. So on that note, I'm going to ask our panel, well, I'll now introduce, you've met Billy already, but he's going to talk in a personal capacity, which is important because that means he himself, not to be reported as a representative of the organisation he works for, but in his own words. We've got Paul, who's from the Methodist Joint Policy Issues, Public Issues team, JPIT I know it as, and he will speak of some of the joining up that goes on, but also of his own personal experience and his story of being involved in how we hold together, yes, with and advocacy. And then Liz. Liz Archibald is from Hexham and Newcastle Diocese, and has been a champion of justice and peace for some time, though she didn't want me to say that. She has been, and she'll speak a little bit about the work that's going on there. Would you welcome all our panel to start? And I'm going to invite, just for a few moments, would you minutes really, each of our panel members in turn, to just say a few words about themselves and their local experience. Can we tie down, as I have to ask myself, who am I and where do I live? There's a wonderful line. The most political saint in history, I think, was Catherine of Siena. And Catherine of Siena told popes and emperors to get back and do the job properly. And then when you read her diaries, she said, but I am the problem. But I am the problem. Sometimes we're part of the problem as much as we're part of the solution. But I'm going to ask our speakers to tell us how they engage with the problem. And I'm going to start with you. Would you like to introduce what you're doing in Hexham and Newcastle?
Hello everybody. What I want to talk about is one particular action that we're taking in Hexham and Newcastle. And it started with the Justice and Peace Council. I want to take you back to 2020, when it was the height of the COVID epidemic. And our Justice and Peace Refugee Project, that had been running then for nearly 20 years then, had to shut along with a lot of other organisations. But we were doing home deliveries to some of our clients. And my husband and I went to visit someone to drop some food bag off, and she wasn't in. And I was a bit annoyed, because she's a 25-year-old woman, what are you doing out? I've made all this effort to come here, where are you? Anyway, I rang her, and she started to cry. And she was crying because she'd been taken into detention, into an immigration removal centre at Dungavel in Scotland. And this is from Newcastle, Scotland. It's a very long story, and I could probably spend an hour talking about it, but actually, over the next 6 weeks, this young woman, 25-year-old, was moved around the country to different detention centres. It was COVID, so she was held in isolation with the threat of deportation. But two things came out of this. One was, that very night when I got home, I got in touch with Justice and Peace Scotland, and a lovely lady from Justice and Peace Scotland then put me in touch with someone who would go into Dungavel. Actually, they didn't go in, it was on Zoom, would speak to this lady and see what she needed. So that immediately was how, as Justice and Peace, we could link even across up into another country, up into Scotland. The other thing was, because she was moved around the country, and I didn't really know what I was doing in order to support her, we had to work with other agencies. And again, a big call out to the Jesuit Refugee Service, because eventually she ended up in London, and she was in Yarlswood. And again, Will from there worked hours, was ringing me at 11 o'clock at night about things, how we could help this lady. And eventually she was released, and she was released on bail. The country that she'd come from was Albania, and people said, oh, it's a safe country, you can go back. But what I learned from that is what is a safe country mightn't be safe for that person. Anyway, fast forward a bit, I was at a meeting, again on Zoom, during COVID, about various organisations working with people seeking asylum. And I learned that a detention centre was being built just 12 miles from where I live, in Consett in County Durham. And we were appalled, because Consett, if you're from the area, it's quite remote, it's, you know, a bit of a backwater in many ways. So people were going to be sent to this detention centre. I brought this to the council, our Justice and Peace Council, and we really felt that we wanted to form alliances. There was a group doing a protest about it at the time, so we joined with them. And this group were very welcoming and very interested, but we sort of felt that we as Christians wanted to do something more. We wanted to say this actually doesn't square with how we're supposed to live. And then when we thought about it, we realised that actually it's not just a Christian thing, it's actually many faiths. In fact, what we've discovered was all of the world faiths, the major faiths, actually talk about welcoming refugees. So from there, we set up meetings, again, all on Zoom, and we formed a sort of little action group, and we decided we'd have a monthly prayer vigil at the gates of the detention centre. Next weekend, it's 5 years since they started. And we have between, I would say, 25 to 35 people come every month First Sunday of the month, we meet at 3 o'clock and we end at 4:45. It's not a long time. The people who come are from various denominations, mainly Christian organisations, I have to say, but various denominations. But about 3 years ago, I got a phone call from someone from the Reformed Synagogue in Newcastle. And since then, a Jewish group have come along. And it's incredible, because this group come along and they sing a lamentation in Hebrew. In Hebrew, I'm right. And it's the most powerful thing, because you feel the pain of generations in that singing. And it's incredible. And we have 15 minutes silence, which is also incredible. The way we organise them is that we don't have a particular leader. We have anyone can lead. We have a liturgy group who sorts out the prayers and sorts out the readings, and they're from various denominations and from poetry. A favourite one is a poem by Benjamin Zephaniah. And people choose which ones they want to use. So we have no hierarchy there. We do have priests who come, and we do have vicars who come, and we have Methodist ministers who come. But everybody is equal. Everybody takes a turn if they wish to lead. We don't say, Father, you're going to lead. Father, you're going to make a blessing. It's a real grassroots organisation. It's taught me a lot, because working with Jewish people, I'm always incredibly cautious of what I say. I'm terrified I put my foot in it. I'm terrified I say the wrong thing. One of the turning points was after October the 7th, and we were having our vigil just about a week later. And the group came, and what was interesting, on that occasion they didn't bring their banner, they just stood as a group of people. And at the end of it, I turned to one of the ladies and I just said, I'm so sorry for your community. And she hugged me and she started to cry. And she said, I'm so grateful you said that, Liz. And that really was a sort of moment of connection. A few weeks later, we heard, just before our vigil was about to start, that one of our colleagues' daughters, who was 16, had been killed in a car accident. And we just got the message before the vigil was about to start. And at the end of it, one of the Jewish leaders came up to me and said, do you need a hug, Liz? And I really did. And it's that bonding that you get. And I think that's what it's taught me, that actually we've got to look at what we have in common. Last November, we were very, very privileged. The Jewish group invited us to attend an alternative Yom Kippur. It was held in public, held outside Newcastle Civic Centre. And it was amazing. They used some of their traditional prayers, but they also read out a selection of the names of the children who'd been killed in Gaza. And they also read the poem by Michael Rosen. And it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. So as I say, that's where we are. Next Sunday we'll be there at 3 o'clock, so if you'd like to say a prayer at 3 o'clock for the people detained there in that Immigration Removal Centre, you're most welcome. Because again, we encourage people who can't be there in person to pray from home. But one funny thing is, one of the things we do, we don't just pray, we also bring toiletries, we bring donations for money for phone cards, and we do a collection there and we hand that on to the visitors group that are taken in. We also have close links with the various protest groups around the detention centre. We also encourage people to write to their MPs any particular issues that come up. But one thing we also do is we negotiated, and it took a lot of negotiation. One of our members negotiated with the detention centre staff for us to take flowers in for the communal areas. And there's nothing that disarms a group of security guards than seeing them standing at the security barrier with bunches of carnations. It takes away all their threat. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. That got us off to a great and inspirational start. I'm just minded that the key word in Fratelli Tutti is encounter. And sometimes in our neighbourhoods, one person put it, we need to mix up the wrong people. And I remember there was, we have a mosque in Armley, and it was sadly under attack. And unlike Catholic churches, that are all locked these days, the mosque is open day and night. They had no security. But what was quite wonderful was there was a Jewish person who works on one of our projects for refugees who is Jewish and is involved in the security at one of the synagogues. Would you like to go and talk to the mosque and tell them how to put careful, sensitive security in place? Bridging the gap. Thank you, Liz. Should we now turn to Paul? Would you like to say a little bit about why you are involved in all this business, given your background and training?
Okay. I think I'll maybe tell you a couple of stories, because I'm better at stories than sort of pontificating. I grew up in North Belfast. This is the Irish corner of the stage. And at the end of my street, there was a massive tar block, and on the side of it, there's a picture of a man with a balaclava and an assault rifle, and it said, "Ulster Volunteer Force, ready for peace, prepared for war." Neither of which was true. And in that community, the cobblestones were red, white and blue, and you were talking about Encounter. My school was entirely Protestant. My church was clearly entirely Protestant. I didn't go into Catholic areas because they were unsafe. So there was nothing of Encounter to be had. So there is an old joke told by both sides in Northern Ireland, which is, how do you know ET's a Protestant, you say, if you're a Catholic? Or how do you know ET's a Catholic if you're a Protestant? And the answer is, well, that's what they look like. Because you've never seen them. And that was kind of how I grew up. And things that changed me were my mother became she started founding an integrated school where Catholics and Protestants in North Belfast were educated together, and so that people could encounter at an earlier age, which was not without its difficulties. And I have to say this, she sadly got dementia now, but just before she couldn't remember things, the school was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. There's about 20 nominations each year, and some person who brought peace to Sudan got it instead, you know. Very annoying. But in that, they saw Encounter. One of the stories she tells is that the community workers in the local area were talking about what the different kids who went to this integrated school as opposed to the segregated schools that most children went to. And my mum was hoping really hard that, you know, our children would be all peaceful and lovely, and they'd be like singing Kumbaya, walking around the place, something like that. And the community worker said, "No, but the riots are better organised." And it turns out that the joy of the rioting was to see the big armoured personnel carriers come in, and then you'd throw stones against them, and that'd be quite fun. You didn't really want to throw stones at anyone else. It was what they called recreational rioting at the time. Because the kids were at school together, they could go, well, we want to watch EastEnders, obviously, but when EastEnders is over, could we all come out and throw a few bricks? And they arranged the timings of the riots in the school. And the other thing that then comes out of it is that those people who were at school started arranging other things, not just riots, and started arranging relationships. And that's what Encounter does. Eventually, over time, not in a straight line. And after that, I was going to talk about, I worked a little bit during the peace process in Northern Ireland. My first job was working with the Northern Ireland Labour Party and then the Ulster Unionist Party as I sometimes say speechwriter. By that I mean I took the speech out of the printer and occasionally dotted an I and crossed a T. But one of the things I found there was I went to a segregated school. I didn't go to the school my mother founded. And really I had no interaction with people who were Catholics before that. And I remember really clearly that the Sinn Féin officers, who were the sworn enemy, I mean, on occasions, people would run down our street with, people would drive down our street with assault rifles and fire them in the air, just as a general intimidation thing. And that was who they were. That was them at the other end. But we had to be pleasant, and we had to be nice to each other, and we had to talk to each other. And I remember really clearly that relationships were formed by doing something. And peace between me and Sinn Féin occurred over a photocopier. Because they'd done out Stormont with really lovely new fancy photocopiers. There was American money, we got everything. It was brilliant, we got coffee machines and stuff, it was great. But they didn't work particularly well. And working with the other bag carrier in the Sinn Féin offices, because we shared the office, the sort of printers and stuff, trying to work against the bureaucracy to get a bloody photocopier fixed over a period of a month was the point at which I realised that possibly Catholics didn't look like E.T. and that Emma in the other office was very much like me, and we had to do something. And by doing something together and walking together, again, you form relationships. And I'll just say something about the work I do now, which is I work for the Joint Public Issues Team, which is the Methodists, the Baptists, the URC are the core members, and the Church of Scotland and the Iona community join in lots of our called associate members. They join in lots of our work, especially if it involves non-devolved matters. And we work together. And it's a fantastic enterprise, and I've worked there for 20 years. I got a 3-month contract, and 20 years later I'm still there, and if they find out, I'm in so much trouble. But the joy of it is that we do something together. It isn't that we sit around and discuss what's the difference between Baptist theology and Methodist theology. We see an injustice, which is often poverty. That's the area I work on most. And we go, how do we influence this world to shape it in a little more just way? What is it our churches can do together? And sometimes, and this may shock you, a Baptist has a good idea. And sometimes a member of the URC will have a good idea. And we work together in order to bring the best of what we have and bring it to bear on the problem at hand. And one of the greatest things that we do together, or the moment that changed me the most, was in a Poverty Truth Commission. I'm kind of looking at Liam at the back, who's doing a workshop on participation, and he knows much more about this than I do. But I walked into a Poverty Truth Commission where people who experience poverty join together, and then they're joined by people who make decisions in their local community. And I walked into that room, and I'm a white middle-class person, male with a PhD. I expect to be respected in every room I walk in. And I didn't know I did until I went in that room. But when I went in that room, all of those people, the person beside me who was clearly couldn't read and write, was as respected as I was. And they worked together to try to get to a solution to a problem. And in that encounter and that striving together, it was an extraordinary place to be. So I suppose if I just give you good news, it is when we work together on something, anything, we form relationships, and in those relationships, that little friction releases a little bit of God. A little bit of God's love comes out. And it's worth doing, and I commend you to do it. I also commend you to Liam's workshop because it's fantastic.
Brilliant. Paul, thank you. Relationships founded by doing something together. Reminds me of an experience in my life. I had the great privilege, when I was a government minister, of going to Kosovo, to Pristina, the day after the ceasefire was organised. And the reason was I was in charge at that time, rowing with utility companies, water and energy, about the environment and the level of bills. And at that time in Kosovo, the water system had gone and the power station had gone. And I screamed at them, if you had anything about you and really did believe in doing things for the environment and poverty, you've got the engineers, get them out to Kosovo and rebuild their power station and water plant. I thought nothing was come from it. It was a kind of angry conversation about regulation. One of the people from an energy company rang me late that night in my little flat and said, John, we're up for it, I've gathered them together, how do we get there? I mentioned it to the Prime Minister, and a week later we flew out in a team to go to Pristina. We got there and the power station was an old Russian power station under cobwebs. The British Army were there, the British engineers, and they said, we don't know how to switch it on. And so they then said there was a Serb who used to be the manager, who lived in the nearby neighbourhood, who had an armed soldier at the end of his garden, and he wouldn't come out for fear. And they were trying to persuade him to come out and switch the power station on. And in that morning, we got the Serb to go to the power station. As we were arriving, a fella arrived on a handcart who was Albanian. And he said, do you know, I used to run this power station before he did. And what happened was, the two of them were engineers. And they stood together, and they went to the wiring, and they rewired that power station together, working together on the electrics without a word about the conflict between them. And the power station's up and running now. And it's that idea. We don't need to discuss the politics or the theology. What can we do using our deep experience and knowledge that we share? Paul, thank you for your contribution. It leads us in a new direction maybe. Billy, you've given us a lot of yourself already, but you said you'd say a few personal words, as it were, about your story. Yes. Over to you.
Can I say, first of all, as someone who worked for Sinn Féin and Stormont until a few years ago, we are very much still connecting with other parties over crappy photocopiers. What's quite funny is part about it sounds like we very similar roles, but part of our job was to submit written questions to different departments, and usually that was based on community issue or constituency issues. But it was always good to get in as many written questions as possible. And we used to sneak in the odd, will the Assembly Commission please comment on the Wi-Fi improvement programme? And then that would take, and then will the Assembly Commission please comment on fixing the leaky roofs in the Sinn Féin offices? So it can very much relate to that. And the American money has run out, unfortunately, so it's probably more. I guess what I'll get into is, and apologies to Anne Farr, who's definitely heard a lot of this already from other EAs, but I'll talk about my work as an ecumenical accompanier in Palestine, and bringing that advocacy back to my own community in Donegal. So, very briefly, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme in Palestine and Israel, it's quite a mouthful, run by the World Council of Churches, sends ordinary people called ecumenical accompagners out to Palestine, out to the occupied West Bank specifically, for 3 months at a time. And what you do is you live in a community in the West Bank. So Anne was based in the village of Yanoum, which, as she said, sadly has been cleared out recently. I went twice. I spent 3 months in the Northwest Bank in a city called Tulkrum. And the second time I spent in the Jordan Valley, which would be in the kind of east on the border with Jordan. And what you're supposed to do in those 3 months is very much plant yourself into these Palestinian communities. And you're there, while you're there, there's a couple of sort of objectives, for want of a better word, when you're out there. The first is to bear witness. And this involves speaking to Palestinians in villages, going out to things like house demolitions. So the Israeli army would demolish Palestinians' houses because they supposedly didn't have permits, even though these permits are basically impossible to get. Demolition of water tanks in the Jordan Valley, which is largely desert. So losing your water tank if you run a farm, basically it's the end of that farm, the end of your livelihood. We went to Palestinians' homes to report on, for instance, the aftermath of arrests. And I'm being quite polite calling it arrests, because a lot of Palestinians are basically abducted in the middle of the night by the Israeli army. Their relatives aren't told what prison they're taken to. If these relatives are lucky, they'll find out from the Red Cross a week or two later what prison their relative might have been taken to. And needless to say, these are extremely harrowing stories to hear. So there's that, getting the stories first of all, and when you're there, you also serve as a protective presence. And the point of that is, you're wearing this EAPPI vest, and you say if there are Israeli settlers who've come to harass Palestinian shepherds or farmers, or the army has come to serve some kind of notice or to demolish things, the fact that you are there with your vest, usually a camera, notebook and pen, those are your weapons when you're out there. And so hopefully you can serve some kind of that, so it's sort of reporting and protective presence. And it was, I can't put into words how hopeless and sad it makes you feel. And I think the real horror of it is that we would check in with ourselves at the end of the day and have these feelings of absolute despair and hopelessness and sadness. And the real horror was that I was feeling that, but I was only there for 3 months and I could go home. The fact that these Palestinians lived in those villages, they didn't have a passport where they could leave. These people were losing their homes and their livelihoods, and that was the foreseeable future for them. I couldn't and I can't imagine that level of just complete hopelessness. And like many EAs, I came back home extremely depressed, feeling quite helpless. You've spent 3 months embedding yourself in these communities, speaking to people in these communities, and you go home and you feel like nothing's been solved. And I think in a way, you never fully heal that, you can't. But what really helped me, and what helps a lot of EAs, is when you start with the advocacy that you do in your own community. So another huge part of being an EA is you take your stories, you come back with enough notebooks to fill your bedroom, hopefully. So you've got these stories, you've got the suffering, the stories, the joys, stories of resistance too. These people they aren't just victims. There's some beautiful stories of community resistance as well. And it is so cathartic to go back into your own community and to tell people about this kind of thing. And I think that because we've heard already about bridging gaps within communities, I think what was interesting about this was we were bridging a sort of gap between a community on another continent and then bringing back some of these stories to your own community. And what was beautiful was, say for instance, I did, at the time I was moving between Donegal and Belfast, so kind of did talks between both. And in Donegal in particular, as I said earlier this morning, I'm from quite a rural area where you would have a lot of farmers. And there was an interesting discussion a few of us had last night. And a point was made along the lines of, facts. We're talking about how you convince people, how you have conversations with people in your community, how do you persuade them? And facts and figures and maps can be useful, but a few of us were saying that in our experience, they very rarely move the dial decisively. It's very few people come away from some kind of discussion and say, right, well, when they told me that percentage and they pointed to that map, that's when I was convinced. You don't often get that. And so, we're human beings, we're emotional. We love stories. We like to hear about people's experiences. And I found really with these presentations that I did, you could actually see people as soon as they heard the stories, because when EAs do presentations, you show the maps, you show the years, the history and everything else, because you need to introduce the context. But it's as soon as you started talking about, right, here's this person I met, here's what happened to them, here's a photo of their house getting demolished. And I think what was really powerful was some of these groups I would talk to would be people like my neighbours. My house is in between 4 farms, and farmers, Irish farmers in particular, due to history I won't get into, are very protective about land, and it's a real emotional connection. And to tell them the stories of shepherds and farmers, Palestinian shepherds and farmers from the Jordan Valley, and say to them, settlers just came along one day and set down homes, and then the army came in and the police came in and said, right, you've lost that, you're just going to have to deal with that, you have half your land now, and you'll be lucky to keep that half your land. And to say to these farmers I knew, imagine if that happened to you. Imagine if someone came in now and took some of your fields and the state came in and said, well, tough luck, sorry pal. And the real visceral reaction of that, because they connected to that. And I got a lot of comments along the lines of pulling out shotguns and things like that, that I will not get into more at this wonderful conference. But that really triggered something in them. And that was amazing to see, because how many hundreds, thousands of miles separate Palestine and Donegal? And yet, these people are going, well, they own a farm, and that farm was violated, and they just have to put up with that. How the hell can they put up with that? And that's when the persuasion really kicked in, because it's just bringing stories from one community into another, and that it really, I was shocked at the power that these stories have. People to this day, people at these talks are asking me, how has this person got along since? Did that person, did they lose their house in the end? We're humans, we really connect to each other, we really like to follow each other's stories. And I'm glad to say that I managed to get my own community quite mobilised. And people were nearly getting out of their seats at some of these talks and were right, what can we do? Let's, enough time talking there, right, let's go out and do something. And it really was a powerful thing. And I think that going back to that, what could I do for these people? And it was those stories. They can be just as powerful as guns, tanks, whatever else the Israelis have thrown at them and are throwing at them and will continue to, unfortunately. Cameras, notebooks, they are very powerful in that wider arc towards justice. So I think I'll leave it there for now, but that was a really powerful lesson I learned myself, and I hope that you can take something. Super.
Can I ask, could you put your hand up if this is your first conference? Quite a few. How many were here last year? How many were here 5 years ago? How many were here 10 years ago? How many were here longer than that? A few. Why do I ask? Because I think in both these contributions, conflict came through strongly, and particularly in Billy's case, you used some phrases, you felt like nothing was possible. You mentioned the despair and the sadness. My wife was actually born and grew up in Northern Ireland, in West Belfast, in a place called Andersonstown. She grew up there in the 60s, born in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s. I have to say, 20 years ago at this conference we were discussing Northern Ireland. We would never have dreamt that these two people would be sat next to each other. And so I can feel a real sense progress can really be made. It really can be made. So we don't need to despair that we can't change the world. With the witness to it, we need photographs of these two together. Give them another clap. Give them another clap. I'm going to now ask whether Liz or any of you feel you want to comment on what the others have said, or anything that's been missed out, and then we'll ask you to join in.
I think for me, it's just the power of encounter. I think that's what's come out so clearly there. And I think that's been my experience in the prayer vigils. And what I didn't talk about was the fact that we're on a main road when we have our prayer vigils, and most people pass and they're driving, they might be a bit curious and look over. Occasionally we get a bit of abuse. We used to get a lot more abuse at the beginning. But even at the height of all the anti-asylum seeker rhetoric that goes on, we still got people bipping their horns and giving us the thumbs up as they drove past. So when people say that the mood of the country is one way, well, it's not for everybody. Some people actually don't think what the rhetoric would have us believe they think. And I think, your experience as well about that encounter is what it's all about. And that really speaks to me. I was at university with a girl who, once she discovered I was a Catholic, didn't really want to speak to me anymore. But I also shared a flat with a girl whose brother was killed by the IRA. And there was 2 Catholic girls in that flat. And I said to Hilary one day, Hilary, how can you bear to share a flat with 2 women, 2 young people who go to the Catholic Church? And she said, but it's not about religion, Liz. And it was, we used to go to church on a Sunday, and 2 of us used to go to the Catholic Church, and she used to go to her Presbyterian church, and then we'd come back together afterwards. And that taught me a lot as well about the power of encounter, so thank you very much.
I just want to sort of echo what you were saying about the power of stories. What I sort of left out was that my career before I went to the Methodist Church was I designed vaccines, and I love a graph. If I ever get to heaven, the first question I'll ask God is, why does the Bible contain no pie charts? And when I first did the work there around poverty, I spent a long time looking through numbers and statistics, and there was purpose to that. And it's not to be, I'm not going to denigrate it. But what moves people's hearts is human story. What moves people's hearts is we are these social creatures who are much better than the rhetoric is often. We want to create relationship with those around us. That's our instinct, and that's how God made us. And tapping into that is how you change things, and you do it with encounter and you do it with story. So yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
I just want to say, I think from listening to yourselves as well, that I think one thing I picked up on is that this kind of work, this Bridging Divides, it's not without challenge. No one's up here saying, well, yeah, we just built bridges in our community and everyone agreed and it was absolutely fine. There's difficult moments, there's emotion, there's sadness, there's tension, there's nervousness. And just listening to you can really get that sense that it's hard work a lot of the time, and it's sometimes I think you get those. Anyone who does this kind of work, you have that moment of I can't do this. And that's having that moment where you go, right, I'm just going to push through. That's the real challenge, I think, because it's often just past that moment that then you really start to make lasting change. It's not just surface level. That's when you start deepening those relationships. And yeah, I think it's really interesting hearing your stories as well.
I'm tempted to open it now to you for questions, but also comments on what you've heard. Is there a roving mic somewhere? There we go, there's a roving mic at the back. Would anybody like to join in the light of what we've heard? Yes, we've got someone there in the middle. Thank you for being the first hand up. And again, would you stand so the interpreters can help?
Hi, my name is Eric Pierce from the Birmingham Diocese. It's a comment about Liz's very moving story about how when they have their meetings, the Jewish dimension added enormously to it. I saw somewhere that there's another dimension which can be added to that, which is when Negro spirituals are sung at the same time. That adds yet another dimension to it, really. How there's that extremely moving as well. That's just a comment for you.
Thank you, Eric. Another comment or question? One nearer the front here, and then one right at the back.
Oh, hi. Robbie. So, my wife did an MA in international relations and focused on a question about whether the role that women played in the successful resolution of the whole troubles in Northern Ireland was crucial. I mean, there's Betty Williams and Mairead Corrigan Maguire, obviously, but I wanted to ask you whether, especially the guys from Northern Ireland and Ireland, if you think that to what extent did the success of that peace and reconciliation have to do with a greater involvement of women in the peace process than in other parts of the world, like Gaza, Palestine.
Do you want to respond to those points? What kind of you want to say? Role of women?
Well, yeah, I'll just start by saying I can't. I feel like I can't personally have as much to say on the peace process because I feel like my experience in Stormont came after that. I was there, just when around COVID times.
So what you're saying, I'm very old, is that?
It was. I can't really comment on that. But what I would say is in Palestine, both groups I was with. So when you go out to a city or a village or whatever for 3 months, you're there with a team of other people from other countries. So you might be in a city living in an apartment with someone from Norway, someone from Argentina, and someone from the UK, which actually was my exact living situation in the Jordan Valley. And both times I was out there, I was the only man on both teams. So it was some of our meetings, you'd meet with local communities and things like that, and we would there would be a lot of Palestinian women's groups. And one thing I found very interesting was, we would have our kind of lists of questions, and my Argentinian colleague in particular would be that sort of very socialist activist left-wing tradition. And it was really interesting. There was a couple of times where she would ask these Palestinian women's groups of, right, there was one point where she said, would you consider yourself a feminist? And it was really interesting to see first of all, a bit of kind of puzzlement. And then, I forget exactly what the answer was, but it was something along the lines of, I'm not really sure if I am in the way you mean it. What we do is we have classes for women in the community here where we teach life skills and we're kind of hope. And it was, that was quite interesting because I learned very quickly that, I don't want to sit here as a white man and say, oh, Palestinian women are all like this, whatever. But from what we did get from our meetings is that there are different conceptions of what it means to be feminist, what it means to be doing work in the community on behalf of women. And that was a real learning experience for us as a team, because it was a moment of, we're a group of Westerners here asking, people from Palestine questions. But that's all I have to say on that.
But to ask a woman on the panel to speak.
Oh, heck. I think one thing I'd like to point out is that the Immigration Removal Centre, where we have our vigils, I think is still the only women-only immigration removal centre in the country. I mean, possibly somebody else might correct me about that, but I think it is. So it is women that are imprisoned there. It is a prison. Let's not call it anything else. And from what I understand, the majority of the visitors whose work we support, as I say, by donations, are women going into it. So there's a lot of ministry of women to women. The members of our prayer vigils are men and women. I've never really done a head count as to what the proportion is. But, as someone who is a sort of cradle Catholic, can I just say it's great to see that I would say most of the organising is done by women. And the liturgy group does have one man on it, but I think the rest are women. And I think it's just good that we don't even really have to think about that. We just take our place there. And as I said before, we do have some priests who come along, but they're not in charge. It's a lay-led organisation. And that's what's really good about it as well, and quite empowering.
In the light of St. Catherine of Siena, a woman, the Church's best politicians, remarks about I am the problem. I think for politicians, perhaps one of the greatest sins, if you like. It's claiming credit for other people's work. So if you were to go to Northern Ireland and visit Stormont, walk down from the castle, and at the bottom in a corner there's a children's playground, and it's dedicated to Mo Nolan, who did much more than Tony Blair to work through the peace process. Could I take more comments or questions, please? I've one straight away here, and then another one there. I'm looking to this side. I'm not so good with this eye, so make sure you wave at me from over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex. I am from A&B Diocese in the Southeast Coast, and I also happen to be the national president of the Newman Association, which was formed by Saint Cardinal John Henry Newman, who formed the university where I was main speaker studied. I've got to say something about stories, and also I'll have a question at the end. And I got very emotional when you talked about your experiences, all of you, especially working with the Jewish people and how you helped each other, and also the two gentlemen on the right. It became very emotional to me. And your experiences, as you said, experiences and stories, they touch your hearts, and they can be very emotional, and they can change people's perceptions about yourself. Just recently, some of you may know, in the news, you may or may not know, there's an issue in South Africa where ordinary people have been fighting illegal immigrants, but then unfortunately they've also been on the streets fighting anyone who is a foreigner, just ordinary people. And so I've got lots of friends from everywhere in the world here. I happened to go and do a small job part-time a couple of weeks ago, and this person said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Eastbourne." "No, but where are you from?" I said, "What do you mean, where were you born?" I said, "I was born in South Africa." Oh my God. I got an attack, not physical attack, a long debate about, you are the people who are xenophobic, you are the people who are... I did not know what to say. I got another group somewhere else a few weeks ago, and people said, "Where were you born?" "In South Africa." I got attacked. I was helpless until one Nigerian man said, "Hang on, you people, you asked this man to go, we're in the middle of nowhere. You asked him to drive you to a supermarket, and he helped you. You didn't ask him where he was from. But now that you know he was born in South Africa, you are attacking him." And then another person said, "Since I got here, I've been your friend." I said, "You've been asking for advice from me. Did I ever ask you where you're from? Did I do anything bad to you?" He said, "No." And then that changed the mood. Then people understood that you can't blame everybody because of a few people who have done something wrong. So I agree with you yourselves that experiences and stories can change things. I'm really grateful for that. So the question I have is, it breaks my heart that people of Palestine continuously, they get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And I say to myself, if they get cut, the blood that comes from their bodies is the same blood that comes from the Israelis. And yet, the mighty United Kingdom, the mighty Americans, they still pay a blind eye to this. How long will it continue for these two governments to pay a blind eye when people, innocent people, are squeezed and they let the Israeli government do as they please? And yet, they are signatories to a number of UN conventions. That's my question.
Would you like to take the mic to the person there?
I'm going to just stand up here. Thank you. So I wanted to share a response to some of the things I've seen and heard, especially the planning linked to Gaza. I did some work with Muslim and Jewish women together. About 3 months ago we went to Rome, and there was a march there where the Jewish mothers and the Muslim mothers with their children were holding hands together. in support of Gaza. And I think the power of women and the power of motherhood is very powerful.
Yeah.
And it challenges something in the concept of armies. I've seen a lot of organisations where women support men's plans, but it sometimes feels that, but it's actually the women's organisations so often are the things that you see, and they're very powerful, and some of the things that are there, you can see it on some of the social media platforms. So they're just supporting really the power of motherhood and women.
One from this side, over there. One in the middle and one towards the back. We'll take those two. I'm doing okay.
Colin Kerr. Encountering others. One of the spaces for encounter that really seems to be being crushed is the mode of nationalism. It's happening at different levels. I'll give one example. The first example was when I was much younger, I had the great privilege of being a student guide at Coventry Cathedral, and they took young people from all over the world, and they stayed at Coventry Cathedral, and it was within John Kennedy House. That's generally where we were all housed and looked after. We were given board and lodging, and £3 a week, which was a king's ransom. That's no longer there. John Kennedy House has been erased. I don't know why completely, but I was really sad when I, like a few years ago, discovered it doesn't exist. It was a wonderful program. It was international. The other thing is UNESCO. The United States has pulled out again from UNESCO. UNESCO has got so many programs which are international, and they bring together young people from all over the place. In this mood of nationalism, we need our politicians in this country to somehow or other bring this back into the front, to be talked about, and we also need to bring it into the churches. This is really important that young people meet together who are internationally. I have friends from 50 years ago still, and I think of them. Thank you very much.
Would you go to the person right at the back, and then we'll take a response. We're already starting to do a giant workshop here of the work that will go on this afternoon.
Paul from Green Christian and Caritas Nottingham. In a similar theme, really, I'd be very grateful if you could do a worked example for me of, and it speaks to this last question, of the situation that's going to confront churches locally around the country, and already is, with the arrival of asylum seekers in their neighbourhoods. There are obviously, hundreds being allocated to former defence sites and such like. There are groups in their hundreds being allocated to cities and towns, and often quite inappropriate places in villages remote from any support. And certainly in our diocese, we've witnessed unfounded protests about the threat of the arrival of asylum seekers, where there's been no actual truth of that it's actually going to happen. 400 people turned out at a public meeting to protest about something that wasn't going to happen. What is the role of churches in that, in de-escalating, in promoting understanding and encounter, when the people that are being talked about aren't even there? And it speaks to this question of nationalism as well. Is there a role that churches can have in promoting good conversations that enable communities to become more hospitable in that situation?
Going close towards the time. Is there anyone with a burning question that I've overlooked with time in the groups? But I'm going to now ask the panel if you'd like to respond to those points. Paul, would you like to go first?
I think, I can't remember your name, I'm very sorry. Alex, sorry. I once forgot my wife's name when introducing her to the Polish ambassador, so it's not you, it's me. I wanted to sort of honour what you said, that those experiences of feeling that you were not welcome, or being made not welcome, That's not the country any of us want to live in. Yet it's an increasing experience around the country. And you asked a question about Gaza, but actually what you said first really spoke to me, and I remember I was giving a talk during the Brexit campaign, and how gentle are the ears in front of me, do you think? What was shouted at me when I gave the talk was to F off, I've decided you're gentle, F off back to Ireland. And it's the only time I've ever been told that on this side of the water, which there is this is an increasing something that is increasingly happening. And if I want to go back to the theme of encounter, I've been doing work for the church around nationalism and prevalent and increasing racism and racist activity. And what's really interesting is that the places where you can detect things like nationalist voting patterns, different attitudes in various surveys about the country, are all the places where you are least likely to meet an asylum seeker or somebody of a different race. That is where this feeling and, in my view, poison grows. So encounter and relationship are absent, and in its space grows discontent and hatred. And somebody talked about social media. It is very clear that those who would stir up those forces know that. And when you look at the targeting data on their ads and on the targeting and the sort of targeting information you can see in various other right-wing outlets, that is the geographies they're going to. So in the absence of any real relationship and human contact, what you're getting is propaganda. And that's deeply unpleasant. So I'd love to give you a worked example, and if you chat to me afterwards, I can tell you what some churches have done. But there is no right answer to that. But I think the root of every right answer is, how do you bring the face and the whites of the eyes of people together? Because at that point, hatred is really hard to sustain. It's really easy to whip it up when that encounter is not there. So everything should be focused on that encounter, and when that encounter happens, often really positive things can happen. So I'll be quiet now.
Comments?
Yeah, I just going off that point of, you know, needing to go up and see the white eyes people. I was talking with a few others outside about, I think we might have been talking about actually about how a lot of this division comes from outside forces, from outside communities. For instance, Brian was talking yesterday about the Ireland is Full movement, and there's a lot of that in Donegal at the moment, but I don't live there anymore, but I would know enough to, you know, still chat to people at home who are clued in, and there's a lot of these people who do come in and complain that Letterkenny's full, we can't have any more, are not in fact from there. They're kind of people that there is an insidious sort of centralised movement that's nearly planting these people in communities. And because, going back to what I was saying about, you know, kind of these community structures, it was nearly like an atrophied the last few decades. People aren't able to tell as much anymore. Oh, I don't recognise these people aren't my neighbours. I think these days people go, well, maybe they are. I don't know, they sound pretty convincing that they're from my town and they're quite annoyed about this. Maybe I should be too. Like, it's easier to convince people like that. And another example is, like, where I live now in East London, I live in Tower Hamlets, which is, I think, it has the highest Muslim population I think of any borough in London or any constituency or something like that, I think it's about 60%. And I mean, despite what you might read on social media, it's a lovely place to live. And actually, I would say in 2 years of living there, the only incident of community sort of tension was when a recently rebranded UKIP party, they wanted to organise a march going right through the middle of Whitechapel. It's still in Tower Hamlets. Whitechapel is a very high Muslim community, and similar to Belfast, it's that same tactic of actually Belfast, and tying it back to Israel and Palestine as well. Communities love to show dominance by going through the areas of those that and it's often framed, unfortunately, as this sort of, well, we've protest rights, we've free speech rights, but it's in complete bad faith. It's about domination, it's about intimidation, and thankfully the planned protest was moved closer into the city of London. But there was actually a great moment of online. There was a counter-protest being organised, and I'd like to think that a lot of the Tower Hamlets community, no matter where you're from or what your creed, was prepared to show a united front. Thankfully, we didn't need to do that. But it's in 2 years, that's the only bit of community strife. So despite people saying, oh, London, East London, it's fallen apart, it's absolutely fine until those very people who complain about it from outside try to come in and interfere with stuff. That's my experience the last couple of years, but it's, unfortunately that kind of sentiment's very powerful right now.
Liz, a last word, Liz.
I was brought up in a pit village in County Durham, and it's still a poor area, and it's mainly sort of white British. The last 25 years I've lived in Newcastle, which is a much more multicultural city. And actually 25 years ago I started volunteering at the Refugee Project, which Justice and Peace ran. And my son, I'm going to embarrass him now, my son at the back there was just a baby, and he used to come along with us to the drop-ins. And there was lots of families there who were seeking asylum. And the kids all played together, and we shared toys together, and we passed on clothes to each other that our children had grown. And Michael was quite a skinny kid, so he often got stuff that the other children had grown out of. And I think just that encounter, we're back again to that encounter. It took me a long time to settle in Newcastle, but the two things I'm really proud about was when we had the Brexit referendum, Newcastle voted to remain. And the other thing was that when we had the race riots last year, they were vastly outnumbered by people in counter demonstrations. And the tagline was, Newcastle is black and white. And that made me so proud.
Lunch is calling. My neighbourhood was described as a cake slice of inner city Leeds, and it was described by the Sun newspaper as white van manland plus a few Asians, which gives you a kind of a caricature. We've two parishes that were joined together down here at the prison and my own parish. And so the priest had two houses, and there's only one priest, and both houses are for 5 or 6 bedrooms. And it'd been empty for years. There were women who are asylum seekers who have no children, who apply for asylum, and they get turned down, but they've the right to appeal. They then have no access whatsoever to public funds. So where do they end up? On Prostitution Road in Holbeck. So our Justice and Peace Commission decided some years back to do something about it. And wonderfully, our parish priest said, take the empty presbytery. And that's now St. Monica's House. It's opposite a community centre, and there are other presbyteries around the world that could be similarly used as houses of hospitality if the church got stuck in. Let's say as well, they crossed the road to the New Wortley Community Centre, which for me is my sounding board and inspiration. I recently had the great privilege with CSAM to go to Rome and to listen to what are called the departments, the dicasteries, about the work that was going on. And I asked the question in the department for integral development, where's the heartbeat of the church of the future? Is it Africa now? What's happening to Latin America? And one person said to me, oh no, Latin America's not over yet. It's just that where you are, you've not yet discovered the significance of building basic Christian communities. I was so enheartened by that I go back to my sounding board of the people in New Wortley who have not got degrees. We have the lowest record for people going to university. So I always love over a coffee to try out with the men and women there. What do you think about liberation? Thinking liberation theology, I thought, we'll have a go, what's liberation? We're not into liberation. And I wrote down what they said. We're into respect, kindness, constant care, and attentive listening. What more is that than the words of Fratelli Tutti, actually, for Encounter and the work we're called to do? Can I thank you for your attentive listening, and can we thank our panel for their contribution this morning?